but she can't remember who else went. Yeah. People from
Hello, everybody. I'm Paul Spitzer, and I've seen some of you before when I came here and talked on several talks on the Arctic and the race for the North Pole. So I remember some of the faces. But tonight, or this afternoon, I'd like to talk about the Boeing's heroic age. And what I mean to refer to is that Boeing in 1945 had just crawled out of being a second-tier company in the U.S. And by 1970, it will be the strongest American company. It will really be the dominant American company, and it will be the dominant company worldwide by that point. And so this talk is largely a discussion of what it did to move from its backward position to preeminence. It's also the best years of the company, as you can imagine. It goes from uncertainty to self-assurance. And you should also note, it's a period when the company goes from being a military company to being a commercial company. And when I say commercial, I mean it sells airplanes, not the advertisements. It sells airplanes to airlines. And airlines emerge from being a sort of a second-rate part of all aviation companies to being the strongest business that aviation companies can have. So it really is a heroic age for Boeing and for aviation, but for Boeing particularly. Starting in 1943 approximately, when this picture was taken, this is a picture of an airplane called 5 Grand. It's the 5,000th B-17 that was built. 5,000 airplanes is an enormous number of airplanes in that era. But they're in the middle of the war, and they're producing airplanes up to about 16 per day. Boeing, the B-17 is probably the most famous bomber of that age. We're in the middle of the Second World War, and most of these airplanes are being used in the European theater. The employment here, the reason I'm showing this picture is because of the employment. Employment reaches about 75,000 in the middle of the war. It's a huge number when the company used to talk about 1,000, 2,000 employees. And you can see it's a very mixed crowd. By this point in the war, there are about half men, half women in the company. It had been predominantly an employer of men up to this point, but the war has changed that. And you know about Rosie the Riveter, I'm pretty sure. It's not a very mixed crowd in terms of the racial composition, but there are a few black faces that you can see in here. And you can see here's one, and then mixed out through the rest of this mass of people are a few more black faces. They will constitute maybe 1% to 2% of the company. The war is going to end, and so it's going to change very dramatically in 1945. One out of 9 people will be retained. Of those 75,000, almost all of them will be gone. And at those numbers, of course, it's not just women that will be let go, it's men and women that will. And if you worked for Boeing, then you probably would lose your job. You had a 70%, 80%, 90% chance of being let go. This is Ed Wells. He designed the B-17. He's a remarkable character. He came out of out of university, was immediately hired by Boeing and given the job of designing the B-17. That would be very unusual. The airplane had already been started by another person, but he took it over, and the airplane was a much desired airplane and praised airplane during the war because it withstood so much punishment. And when I mean punishment, of course, I meant fighter planes and anti-aircraft guns. I want to ask him how he brought this about, and he said, well, you know, every time an airplane was lost, we would try to figure out a way to learn what caused that, and also a way to make the airplane survivable. You don't know about the ones that are lost over enemy territory, but the ones that come back, you can sort of figure out what the danger was and how to repair the problem. You can tell that he's an engineer because he has a crew cut, and he wears an ill-fitting suit. In any event, as time goes on, he becomes sort of the soul of the company. He's a very modest individual. He's hugely intelligent. He works easily with other people. He does many of the things by committee. And so one of the things that made Boeing great at that time was just how smoothly running the company was. He's not the president, but nonetheless, he's the person who sort of makes that that sort of company of 75,000 people work. This is the B-29. The B-17 becomes obsolete in the middle of the course of the war, and so they start building this airplane. One of the reasons that this airplane, which is largely forgotten now, is that it's important, is because it dropped the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the result is that it's rarely shown these days because there's a lot of opposition from about peace and war issues. So, but this airplane is very important at the end of the war. It's modern in a way that almost in ways that are not so obvious in 1945. It has radar-controlled guns, it's pressurized, it has a very long range. It was intended to fly to bomb Europe from the United States. It never had that range, and it never really had enough range in the Pacific theater. But in any event, it's a much admired airplane, and the Russians copy it bolt for bolt and built it under not under license, but sort of surreptitiously. We'll get back to Ed Wells later in a very strange sort of way. This, This is William Allen. He becomes president of the company in the middle of the war, and he becomes president at a time. He becomes president just after the end of the war, and he becomes president at a time when nobody really wants to take over a military company. There isn't a business for a military company yet at the end of the war. They're laying off people, they're cutting contracts. The B-29 contract, which was for 3,500 airplanes, is shrunk down to 50 airplanes for Boeing. They're told basically to finish the airplanes that are on the production line, and that's it. And also, people tend to have an attitude that the war must have been a really prosperous time for Boeing, and that wasn't the case. The military and the Roosevelt administration was very careful of how it spent the money, and it kept profits extremely low. And at the end of the war, they had started a policy of renegotiating profits. So if you made a lot of profits, they would renegotiate it. and they would renegotiate it down to 6.5%. Well, most companies can't very well work on 6.5% profit. It's, you know, 1/2 of what the profit that he would usually expect. So William Allen, who is the lawyer, the prominent lawyer for the company, eventually agrees that he's going to take, that he will step in as president. And he's a very modest man, very similar to the Ed Wells. And he has learned to work with Boeing, William Boeing. And William Boeing is a very retiring sort of person. William Allen tends to follow that line. He's doesn't like publicity. He doesn't like, he's a non-complaining man. The company becomes a non-complaining company. So when it loses a contract and it feels it's unfair, it just absorbs the loss and goes on with its business. Once somebody asked William Allen, how do you make a successful company out of something like pre-war Boeing? And he says, you know, it's not very hard to be successful in an expanding business. So William Boeing, the founder of the company, is no longer with the company. By 1945, he has been gone for about 10 years. Pre-war, as they searched for products to build, they decided that they would try to build large commercial airplanes, airliners. And this is one that they designed for Pan Am, and it's called the Pan Am Clipper. If you can see that it's actually a flying boat, and or what we call a flying boat. It's really not a boat. That is just the expression of the time. And it is the first airplane that can really do passenger service across the Atlantic. And when I say across the Atlantic, that isn't quite, that's a bit misleading, because actually what it does is it flies to Newfoundland, up the coast of Canada, flies from Newfoundland to Ireland, from Ireland to London. And at the time, it's a flying boat, not only because they're worried about it not going down in the middle of the Atlantic, but because there really aren't enough airfields to take really large airplanes. Those arrived during the course of the war, but we're still be a little ahead of the war. The charge for going across the Atlantic at the time is about $700 one way. That's about the same charge as it is today, because I checked a couple of weeks ago of what a transatlantic flight is. It was a very expensive service, and it could hold about 2 dozen people on a flight like that. It took 29 hours, and it was a very rough ride because these airplanes are not pressurized, so they fly at 8,000 feet or so in the midst of all the turbulence that comes of the airflow that comes off the earth. But it was, in spite of being a long flight, an overnight flight, it was also a very luxurious service. And here you can see they set off one portion of the interior and are serving meals with silverware and wine and champagne if you need it, and with, of course, the steward on the airplane and the hostess. And then at night they had bunks for the passengers. Claire Luce, who some of you may remember her name, she was the wife of the editor of Time and an ambassador to one of the smaller European countries. Prominent woman and a writer, said, people in the future will not appreciate how luxurious we were able to travel. Since only 12 of these airplanes were built, and since airfields became common, they disappeared. These airplanes disappeared from service at the end of the war. And so Boeing was still very much just a military builder at the end with not very good prospects for the future. This is a DC-7, and Boeing and Douglas airplanes, Douglas company, had a long time struggle with each other, in which Douglas won every competition. And in the DC-7 dominated the airways. Before it, the DC-6 did it. Before that, the DC-4 did it. And and before that, into the 30s, the DC-3. The airplane, at this point, at the end of the war, could use some of the engines that were built during the war. These were much more advanced engines than had been available in the 30s. And so it had the speed of about a fighter plane during the war, but they were very complicated engines. And engines sort of determine whether an airplane is going to be good or not. The engines are responsible for all the big steps that occur with, or revolutions that occur in the air industry. The 300 and some of these were built, so it's an indicator that only 300 were built when 7,000, 13,000 were built with bombers gives you an indication of the size of the commercial market. It's much smaller, but Douglas controls the commercial market. And in 1957, when this airplane comes out, the airlines start carrying more passengers than ocean liners. And this is, we won't talk about ocean liners, but they disappear within a couple of years for the most part. William Allen, the president, sort of thought that he needed to have something to offer it in the post-war. And so they took the B-29, which was as sort of a smaller airplane as they could build it for a bomber, and put a large fuselage on it, and you can and hope to sell that as a commercial airliner. And so where Douglas sold 330 of its DC-7, Boeing sold 56 airplanes. And so they probably lost money on those airplanes. But let's look around the airplane. You can have an idea of what's going on. They're only, the seats are only about 4 abreast. They're made to look like couches with nice cloth, soft cloth. This airliner, unlike the Douglas, has this little small lounge here where you can go down and have a drink and smoke. You could smoke on in any seat on an airliner. The other thing that's interesting in this is right here there are the lavatories and the powder rooms, and those are the least safe places in the airplane, because these propeller airplanes lost propellers. They just flew off, and if they hit the fuselage, they went through it, and that must have been a rude experience for some people. In any event, Boeing sold these, and they flew across. They were the most sort of luxurious of the airliners at the time. They also changed this airliner into a military plane. It had started out a military plane, and you see it here on the left, and it was a tanker or refueler airplane for the Air Force. And you have to remember, at this point, 1946 on, there is a Cold War between us and Russia, and there's a need, the military has a big need for carrying cargo and for carrying fuel for long-range bombers. And so Boeing builds 880 of these. So it's really a huge business, but it's such a prosaic business that Boeing sort of hides this part of its history. But this airplane really carries this airplane here really carries Boeing through some of the early post-war. The end of the war has some interesting developments, and one of them is, of course, the development of jet engines. And Boeing had done something during the course of the war that they wouldn't anticipate the use of, and that was it developed its own wind tunnel. And when the jet engines came out and Boeing was trying to continue its business of building American bombers, the question was, where do you put the engines on a bomber? These were pretty weak engines, but they're all that are available at the time. And so Boeing has a wind tunnel, and it can try out where it's going to put the engines. It's going to put them on the body, on pods, on the front of the airplane, on the back of the airplane, put them inside the airplane. And Boeing figures out basically the configuration of the future. And airplanes in the future will have jet engines suspended below the wings on pods. And it's another indication of the strength of Boeing's engineering force coming out of the Second World War to have worked out that. And the other part of it is, of course, swept wing designs. And Boeing gets that from the German data that they get in contact with. This airplane is the airplane that beats 4 or 5 other competitor airplanes from competitor companies. The idea of swept wings and podded engines is enlarged for an intercontinental bomber. Boeing is still basically a military provider, and but it's very similar to the one that you just saw. Podded engines hung from the wings, and but on a much bigger airframe. Boeing isn't really interested in building a commercial air version of this because this design is unsuited for commercial, for an airliner. You can see that there's the landing gear is in the body. It wouldn't leave space for passengers, and of course most of the tankage on an intercontinental airplane would be in the body. Because you need so much of it, and that it wouldn't leave passengers again for space for passengers. It's pretty much the last successful bomber, certainly the last one for Boeing, and pretty much the last successful bomber for the US. This airplane is still flying when the more modern airplanes came out after it have been replaced. It's still flying 70 years after, and it was first designed and flown. So it's a remarkable airplane. What the US can do in intercontinental bombers, the Russians can do. We're in the middle of the Cold War, and the Russians don't do jet engines on their intercontinental, but they're building intercontinental bombers as well. And the US Congress, and more importantly the military in this case, realized these bombers, intercontinental bombers, make every place on the coast very unsafe. Coming in from over the ocean, any city can be easily, any coastal city can be easily bombed. And so they decide that they're going to move, the military just tries to force the airplane companies to move their manufacturing facilities into the center of the company, places like Kansas and Nebraska and such. And Boeing has a plant in Wichita, Kansas. And William Allen is talking to the manager of the Wichita factory that it owns, and that man, Schaefer, says to Boeing, well, you know, I don't understand your antipathy to moving to Kansas. And Alan says, well, you know, we don't want, it's flat here. And he says, the Schaefer says to him, well, you know, what's the wrong with that? Why don't you treat others, learn to move to like Kansas? And Alan is puzzled and he says, there's no Mount Rainier here. And the Kansas manager says, you know, if Mount Rainier were here, you could see it. So, anyway, the response to the problem that never occurred of moving the plants was intercontinental ballistic missiles. And Boeing never got very far into intercontinental missiles and into the aerospace. It was an airplane builder. It did some things, and it built this, which is called the Minuteman missile. It's a solid. It doesn't have liquid fuel in it. It has solid fuel. It's sort of a rubbery-like material, and they put it into silos into Montana and deep down underground and into North Dakota and other places. And but most of the missile business is in electronics and other sorts of things that Boeing doesn't predominate with. So it's not a continuing big part of Boeing's future. In order to be in this sort of business, you need to have strong political representation in Congress. And so here's a picture of, which one did you say? Jackson and Magnuson, yes. And they're very strong on American defense or Cold War issues, and pretty liberal on other ones. So they do a good job of representing Washington State at the time. I've always wondered what are they talking about? If I wrote the lines for this, it would be something like, "Okay, Warren, I've got some Depends in my locker." There is a constant comment, or used to be a constant comment or criticism of Boeing as being the lazy bee, a company which hardly did any work at all, that had far too many employees, made too much money and such. And I'd like to sort of challenge the whole notion of the lazy bee. And you can see here that some of these tables are empty already. You know, there's some people that have been let go. But Boeing is a type of company, or at that point was a type of company that couldn't do without lots of excess labor. For example, if you're building an airplane like a B-47 or such, you have to have some people who can do the preliminary design. Then you have to do some people who can do the details. Then you need to have somebody draftsman who can take those details and make them into workable tools. And you need somebody who's you need tool builders. And the work keeps, at that point, you don't need preliminary design anymore. And so you're gonna keep them around even for the next airplane. And after the tool builders, it's gonna go to the mechanics, and then it's gonna, so Boeing was always very overstaffed, and it deliberately did it because if there was a problem, it could throw people, as they said at the time, they could throw people at the problem. So it was somewhat largely deliberate, and it worked very well for Boeing. at this time, about 1952, the British brought out an airplane from the de Havilland Company called the Comet. It was it was about 5 years ahead of its any real competitors to it. It was designed to fly British routes, which were the imperial routes so that it could go from London to Johannesburg or London to India or something. And the Flight 2, because of that, it didn't really have the range. The engines are too weak. The development of engines isn't up to the task. And so it takes about 5 hops, 1,500-mile hops to get down to Johannesburg. It's not an airplane as a result that really interests the rest of the world. And the U.S. None of the U.S. builders really see an opportunity in commercial airplanes or commercial jet airplanes at this point. But this airplane draws a huge amount of attention. It suffers from some catastrophic crashes, and we'll talk about. This is the airplane being built, and I wanted to show it to you because how different this is from the way that Boeing builds airplanes. This is built almost by hand, as you can see here. There are drawings sitting on the airplane wing because there's probably some disagreement between what the drawings are. They haven't the sort of engineering force that a company like Boeing has. And then you can see over here this sort of lightweight trolley that they're working on. Nothing like that would you find it at Boeing. Boeing really builds very solid construction pieces. And you see all these wires hanging from the ceiling. I assume they're electrical wires. And then I also said that the airplane had some catastrophic crashes, and you may remember them. And we'll look. You can see these windows here with the square corners. They unfortunately didn't realize that those square corners concentrated stress in the airplane, and those windows started with cracks, and the airplanes fell apart due to the pressure inside of the airplane, air pressure. So jet travel was stopped for a while, except in Russia. And the Russians were just a little bit behind in building jet airplanes. And that the Russians were did build jet airplanes was a really worrisome thing to the West and to Boeing. Boeing News, which was a newspaper that was given to workers, came out weekly. In several weeks, they featured the Russian airplane as, which I think indicates the worry inside the company about competition from the Russians. They had taken the wings off of a bomber, put a larger fuselage on it. It was not a very successful airplane and had the same problem that the de Havilland airplane, the Comet, did, namely it had frequent crashes. And it didn't have it wasn't built for commercial reasons, and so that it could fly at any cost. It didn't have to meet payrolls and such. The Khrushchev, who was premier at the time, supposedly was told by the builder not to fly in the airplane because of the builder didn't consider it a reliable airplane, a safe airplane. Boeing's response was this airplane. This is the Dash 80, which is a smaller version of what was going to come, the 707. And this is a modern airplane similar to the bombers that it built, podded engines, swept wings, but it is intended as a cargo airplane and a tanker for the military. And again, this is those airplanes will sort of carry Boeing through the next few years. The military, again, is dominant over the commercial, but this is going to be changed into a commercial airplane. The test pilot for it is a man named Tex Johnson. He's not really a Texan, but mostly people know him from being around with a cowboy hat on and cowboy boots and the western shirt. He's a very flamboyant guy. I've met him a few times. He looks like a Mississippi gambler or some sort. But he's a very nice. He was a very nice fellow, and he did most of these test flights. And the best known of those was during the Seafair Parade. He decided that to give him a show, and you can see on the right-hand side of this picture the airplane doing an inverted roll over the Seafair Parade, and then doing it again a second time. It was the management of the company didn't know about this at all and was very upset about it. But Tex Johnson said, "Well, you want to sell airplanes? This is the way to go about doing it." I did ask him what the forces on the airplane were, and he says, "Well, if you do it right, it just experiences normal gravity on all even upside down as it rolls." And I'm not sure he's right about that. But in any event, other people tried to do it and have crashed 707s. And on the left you see that Tex Johnson is the only person at Boeing that I know of who has become really a public figure and is copied in Hollywood. The picture on the left is from the movie Dr. Strangelove that some of you may have seen. And in it, it's a dark, very dark comedy of World War III. And the person who's emulating or characterizing Tex Johnson, the Slim Pickens, jumps onto a bomb and rides it down in Russia. The airplane that changes everything is this one, the 707. It's, I don't think it's really gotten its due. It brings on the modern age of jet airplanes, and it shows them what sort of configuration is best to go about doing that. It's, in my mind, the most important jet airplane, jet airliner. It's much bigger than the Comet. The Comet has about 40 seats. This has about 140 to 190 seats. It's a much faster airplane than the Comet. It's at 600 miles an hour. Although the Comet makes the first transatlantic flights, the 707s follow it a couple of weeks late, 2 weeks later, and jet airplanes then dominate the North Atlantic. And when I say the North Atlantic, I'm also implying that it's the most important route in the world. It's the route that really, in these earliest years, make the money for the airlines. The first flight over to Europe, some people got on. The flight was to Paris. They went to Paris, had a late lunch, and came back on the same airplane. And it was called somebody invented the expression, the jet age, for that. The Holiday magazine covered it and said, you know, this isn't necessarily all good. People who can fly the Atlantic in 6 hours and come back on the same day are going to be different, feel about it differently. And the answer, what was the difference? They're going to be impatient. And I think that's true. We are, we don't want to travel across the Atlantic in 29 hours like they did on the early Clippers. The this, I've showed you TWA airplane because Howard Hughes is going to be the owner of TWA, and things will change under Howard Hughes. He comes to the company and he says, I want to buy the whole first year of production. And that's a remarkable offer. And you won't find this in books. This is sort of out of the documents and the archives. And Boeing just flat out refuses to do that offer. And he says, well, let me have the Dash 80, which is, and I want to fly it and see what it's like. And then he took the airplane, the sales airplane for the Boeing, because this airplane hasn't quite been built yet. And he takes it off and refuses to return it and wants to force Boeing into selling him the first year. And William Allen has sent off a test pilot with him. And so he's not only got his airplane, Allen's airplane, but Allen's test pilot. And Hughes, who used to be a very skilled aviator, has lost most of his talents, and he's in the process of losing most of his mental capacities too. And he bangs the airplane into the ground and damages it, and he does some things that the FAA is going to fine him for, and William Allen gets the test pilot to take the blame for these events instead of Howard Hughes. This is Howard Hughes. He's the richest man in America. He owns the patent on the drill bit for oil wells, and so that's where his money comes from. As I said, he's a remarkable man. He made some wonderful movies in his earliest years, in addition to being a pilot. And when he can't buy the first year of Boeing's production, he goes to Ed Welch. Remember him at the beginning, the person I told you was the sort of soul of the company. And he tries to hire him away from Boeing under the most peculiar of conditions. Wells goes to meet him in a nightclub in Hollywood, and at the table, or at their booth, actually, where they are, Howard Hughes is sitting with some starlet that no one has ever heard of since that, and he tries to hire Wells under those peculiar conditions. And Wells told them, no, under no way, I'm not going to join you. And he comes home and he told his sister this story, and he says that man just doesn't know how to take no for an answer. And I happened to know the sister many years ago, and she was the one who repeated this story. But again, you're not going to find it in any other source. This is the reason that we're talking about selling the first year of production. In the 30s, we're going back 20-some years, the United Airlines and Boeing used to be one company, part of one larger company. And United Airlines bought the first of these airplanes. These are propeller airplanes with big engines, but they're a brand new design in the mid-30s, 1933. And they are far in advance of the competition. It's a smooth-skinned metal airplane with retractable landing gears and these huge engines on the mounted forward of the wings. It's a Boeing sort of, again, win or discovery of the best configuration. And Boeing says to United, okay, well, we'll send you the first year of production. And instead, what happens is that the airlines say, we can't be a year behind United. We'll lose all of our customers. We'll be broke at the end of the year. And so they go to Douglas and they say, why don't you build us an airplane that can compete with that? And the strange thing is, Boeing at that point didn't have a wind tunnel, and it used the wind tunnel at Caltech to design this airplane. Douglas also had people at Caltech, and the data from the Boeing airplane was leaked over to Douglas, and I've learned that privately from the archivist at the Caltech. So this is Boeing has learned its lesson, and it's not going to sell a year of production to anybody, and it's well remembered in the company. The person who got Douglas to build these DC airplanes that overshadowed Boeing in the 30s and 40s and 50s was Cyrus Smith at American Airlines. And Boeing sold its airplanes to basically only 4 airlines at the time. They dominate the American market. The American market's much bigger than anyone else. And so Boeing, nonetheless, even though he's closely associated with Douglas, he comes to Boeing and says, well, what can you offer? And Boeing says, well, here's the airplane. And he looks at it and he says, well, he looks at the mock-up, really, because the airplane isn't completed yet. And he says, well, it really doesn't seem really as wide as the Douglas airplane, which hasn't been built. It's 10 to 12 months behind the Boeing airplane. And Boeing says, well, no, it's almost as big as, and Smith makes very clear to Boeing that he will not buy the airplane. And so Boeing decides at the last minute it's going to enlarge its airplane. And so at a huge amount of cost of building new tools and jigs and heavier landing gear and all this, it is going to go ahead. In short, it is going to let the customer decide what he really wants. And at that point, William Allen and Cyrus Smith go into a room privately, and they come out with the contract. And I mention this because I don't think that any of these deals, I shouldn't say any, but the deals cannot be done. They cannot be done without some extra money being passed from one party to another. There's something fishy about going into a private room with another person and making a deal. And in short, there's bribery in the air industry, and although we never talk about it, it's there. These are the advertisements, or some of the advertisements of the era. And at the right, you see a very conventional sort of advertisement, you know, but on the left is a much more interesting one. And what it's saying, without pointing it out, is this airplane is smooth because even a quarter can sit on a table by itself. And the little boy is listening to his watch, and so this advertisement is saying this airplane is really quiet. And they are quiet by any comparison to a propeller-driven airplane of the age. And the other things that you can see in this, if you're a airliner person, is that the walls are smooth. They're basically a sheet of aluminum with some coloring on it. So they're much easier to clean than the old airplanes with cloth walls. And the last thing that you wouldn't notice is that there's a window right by this young boy's arm. And Boeing, Ed Wells decided that he would put in twice as many windows into the airplane, so that basically even if the person next to the window had his face against the window, there was a window in front that you could sort of look out of. So this advertisement carries a lot of stories with it. Now we're going to get into the age of where Boeing dominates the market. after the 707 comes out in 58, in 1963, they built a smaller version of a smaller airplane. It uses many of the same parts as the 707, so Boeing is really able to control its cost much better than anybody who's just starting out in the industry. And this airplane is designed exactly for its market. Boeing's marketing has determined where the airports are that it's going to be suited for, what altitudes they are, what the temperatures are. It's perfectly marketed, and it dominates its market too, just as the 707 did. 1,800 of these will be built, and Boeing is really now the dominant, obvious leader of the industry. That was 63. In 67, they bring out this, the 737, now 50 years old, and still not going very strong, but still out there. And so this is a shorter range airplane for smaller numbers of people, and the, Boeing has again captured the market. And then the last capture is this. This is the 747. It's a huge airplane, and Boeing knows that unneeded but available will be enormous new engines, and so it builds an airplane that's really bigger than the market can handle. But Boeing is the only airplane company that can survive building this ahead of the market growing large enough. And so Boeing, this 707, is sometimes the queen of the skies, is the huge giant that changes the airplane industry by carrying huge numbers of people and bringing about the deregulation of the airlines and lowering costs, making it made available not just as a luxury form of travel, but a common form of travel. And there is one problem with all this. Now too many airplanes and too many seats. Boeing is the cause of this next problem. Yeah. This is the Boeing bust, and in 1969, suddenly they realized the market isn't as big as we had hoped. It is, these airlines have stopped ordering airplanes. They're not even interested in ordering more airplanes. And so huge numbers of Boeing employees have to be let go suddenly. Some people realize these are great opportunities to go into other businesses. I once met a man who bought 3 houses at the bottom of the market in Seattle. And so some people prospered. And in the midst of this, Boeing is also building another airplane. And then this is where we sort of will finish our story. This is the 2707, or the supersonics. The British have built a supersonic, the Concorde. The Russians have built a supersonic at the same time. And again, the US says, well, we can't be behind the British, and we can't be obviously behind the Russians. We have to build our own supersonic, and it has to be bigger, and it has to be faster, and it is. It's much faster, and it's much bigger than the British and the Russian airplanes. And so in the midst of this, some people, public citizens, start agitating against it. And they're saying, look, at the altitudes it's going to fly, it's going to burn out the ozone layer, and and the noise of it is going to shatter windows. And so the FAA does some tests, and this is in Kansas City, I think, and it says, yep, it does shatter windows. And so the Congress now has second thoughts about this, and the end of the era has arrived when Congress says, no, we're going to stop paying for the development of this airplane. And in one sense, this probably saves Boeing a lot of grief at this point. the US government still has to pay off its expenses in the development of this airplane. And they pull Boeing out of its bust, and we see that a new era starts at this point. But my lecture ends. And I will try to answer questions, but we'll see what happens.
What happens next?
Well, I think Boeing, what happens next is the question, and I think the answer is Boeing coasts along on its reputation during the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. And it doesn't recognize some of the things that have changed. It doesn't recognize the rise of Airbus, which becomes, will displace Boeing as the dominant airplane builder. And that's the biggest one. And it isn't really any longer comfortable in the military market as it used to be. And the worst part, of course, is what you all know. It bought Douglas Airplane. And Douglas had management had a huge influence on how Boeing went about its business. And Boeing is suffering because of that at this point. And maybe, you know, if there's an interest, I'll give another talk on the modern Boeing. But I think Boeing coasts, after 1970, it coasts on its reputation. That's the era when I was there.
I might have misunderstood, but did you say the 737 is kind of coming to an end?
It has to come to an end.
Because
Everything I've read, and I'm not sure why, maybe, but it has several bits of old technology in it, and it also was built for engines that were sort of small in diameter. And that's not how the best engines are built now.
Because almost everything at SeaTac seems to be a 737. Or Alaska Airlines.
Alaska uses a lot of them. Southwest only has 737s, and so that, and it's an American, you know, we're an American airport. So, but worldwide, Airbus is producing more competitors than aircraft in the same size and range, and they're lighter. They have more modern technology in them.
And the 757 and the 767 are hardly used at all for passenger service, right?
Well, when I said Boeing was sort of coasting along, those came out in the 1980s, 1983 approximately, and I think those are sort of indications of coasting along. Those airplanes are still being, a few of them are still being flown, but the 737 is still being, but from the 50 years ago is being flown. So they just, they weren't at the top of their game in 1983. Not to say that they're bad airplanes. Sonny? Boeing's in trouble again, yes. It's a daily bit, and I have to say that, you know, I think Boeing has made so many mistakes that it's not unreasonable that they're in trouble again. But I'm not sure that Congress is the way to find out about how Boeing's troubles, because I think a lot of people are grandstanding in Congress to sort of get themselves on television.